Little did the sneering ranch staff know that this man in mud-stained boots was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives, one worth exactly $50 million. Standing at the edge of his modest wheat field, Thomas Reed wiped the sweat from his brow and gazed at the endless Montana sky. His calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of 20 years working the land, while his patched overalls and worn work boots spoke of a life lived honestly, if not luxuriously. The winds carried the familiar scent of earth and wheat, a reminder of countless dawns spent nurturing crops that barely paid the bills. At 52, Thomas was known throughout Clearwater County as the farmer who never gave up. Even when drought threatened his crops 3 years ago, he'd worked double shifts at the local grain elevator to keep his small farm afloat. His neighbors respected him not for what he owned, but for his unwavering spirit and willingness to help others in need. The small farmhouse behind him, with its fading white paint and creaking porch, had been his sanctuary since childhood. Every nail, every weathered board held memories of his father, teaching him about responsibility and the dignity of hard work. "It's not about what you have," his father would say, "but what you do with what you've been given." Thomas adjusted the frayed cap on his head, a habit he'd developed over years of contemplating life's challenges. The morning sun cast long shadows across his 15 acres, modest by Montana standards, but every inch represented years of struggle and determination. His old Ford pickup, parked near the barn, had seen better days, its rust spots and dented, fender telling tales of countless trips to town and back. But today was different. Thomas felt the weight of the envelope in his jacket pocket, pressed against his heart like a secret too precious to share. The papers inside represented more than just his ticket to a new life. They were proof that sometimes fate had a way of rewarding those who never lost sight of their dreams. His mind wandered to the horses he'd always loved. Since childhood, he'd watched the wild mustangs roaming the distant hills, their freedom and grace embodying everything he aspired to achieve. He'd sketched them in his worn notebook during lunch breaks, dreaming of the day he'd have his own ranch. Even now, at his age, he kept that same notebook, filled with plans and drawings of the perfect horse ranch he'd build someday. The local folks knew Thomas as a quiet man who kept to himself, someone who'd wave hello at the general store but rarely joined in town gossip. What they didn't know was that beneath his weathered exterior lay the heart of a dreamer who'd never stopped believing in possibilities. Every penny he'd saved over the years went into a mason jar labeled Ranch Fund, a gesture that seemed more symbolic than practical, given the modest income his small farm generated. But life had a way of surprising even the most steadfast souls. 3 months ago, everything changed. Though nobody in Clearwater County had noticed, Thomas had kept his secret close, continuing his daily routines as if nothing had shifted in his world. He still drove his old pickup to town for supplies, still wore his patched clothes, and still helped old Mrs. Henderson with her vegetable garden every Sunday. Looking across his field now, Thomas allowed himself a rare smile. The wheat swayed gently in the morning breeze, golden stalks dancing to nature's rhythm, unaware that their caretaker was about to embark on the biggest journey of his life. He reached into his pocket, feeling the envelope that contained proof of his fortune, a lottery ticket that had transformed him from a struggling farmer into a millionaire several times over. Yet Thomas hadn't changed. His clothes remained simple, his manner humble. The only difference was the quiet determination in his eyes as he planned his next move. Today, he would drive to Silver Creek Ranch, the most prestigious horse property in the state. The ranch had been on the market for months, its price tag keeping potential buyers at bay. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. He knew what awaited him. There, The judgmental looks, the dismissive attitudes, the assumption that a man in worn boots and faded jeans couldn't possibly afford such grandeur. But Thomas Reed had learned long ago that true worth wasn't measured in dollars or appearances, but in the strength of one's character and the power of their dreams. As the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, Thomas took one last look at his modest farm. Soon everything would change, but he would remain the same man his father had raised, honest, hard-working, and true to his values. The only difference was that now he had the means to prove that sometimes the most remarkable stories come wrapped in the simplest packages. The day Thomas Reed's life changed forever began like any other autumn evening in Montana. After a long day of working his wheat field, he sat at his worn kitchen table, the same one where his family had shared meals for 3 generations. The old radio crackled softly in the background, its familiar static mixing with the chirping of crickets outside his window. His dinner, a simple bowl of homemade stew, sat half-finished as he absently thumbed through a well-worn catalogue featuring ranch equipment. Mary, his closest neighbor and friend of 20 years, had stopped by earlier that day, insisting he try his luck with the state lottery. "Thomas Reed," she'd said, her voice carrying that maternal tone she'd developed since his wife Sarah passed away 5 years ago. "Sometimes you need to let life surprise you." She'd pressed $5 into his calloused palm, refusing to take no for an answer. Thomas wasn't one for gambling. He believed in earning his way through life, just as his father had taught him. Every dollar he'd ever owned came from honest work and careful saving. But something about Mary's insistence, combined with the date, it would have been Sarah's birthday, made him reconsider. Sarah had always told him he was too set in his ways, too reluctant to take chances. So that evening, instead of heading straight home after delivering his grain to the elevator, he'd stopped at Jensen's general store. Old Pete Jensen, who'd run the store for as long as anyone could remember, raised an eyebrow when Thomas asked for a lottery ticket. "First time for everything," Pete had chuckled, printing out the ticket with numbers Thomas chose carefully. Sarah's birthday, the day they'd bought the farm, and the number of acres his father had started with. Now, sitting at his kitchen table, Thomas barely paid attention as the lottery numbers were announced on the radio. He was more focused on calculating how many more seasons it would take to save enough for even a down payment on a modest ranch. The ranch fund mason jar on his windowsill caught the last rays of sunset, the meager savings inside a reminder of how far he had to go. But then something made him pause. The announcer's voice seemed to grow louder, more distinct. Thomas reached for the ticket he'd absently tucked into his shirt pocket, spreading it flat on the table beside his mother's old checkered tablecloth. As the numbers were repeated, his weathered fingers traced each one on the ticket, his breath catching in his throat. And tonight's winning numbers are 7, 15, 23, 31, 42, and the power number is 8. Thomas read his ticket again, and again. The numbers aligned perfectly, like fence posts in a straight line across his property. His hands began to tremble, causing his coffee cup to rattle against its saucer. The grand prize, $50 million, seemed impossible to comprehend. It was more money than his entire family had earned in generations of farming. For a long moment, Thomas sat completely still, the only sound the ticking of the old clock his grandfather had mounted above the stove. He thought about Sarah, wondering if somehow she'd had a hand in this from above. She'd always said their luck would change someday. "Good things come to those who stay true to themselves," she'd tell him, especially during the hard times. His first instinct was to call Mary, to share the news with the person who'd quite literally handed him this fortune. But as he reached for the phone, he hesitated. Thomas had lived long enough to know that money had a way of changing things, changing people. He'd seen it happen in Clearwater County before, when the Anderson family struck oil on their property. Suddenly, everyone was their best friend. Everyone needed a loan or an investment in their latest scheme. No, Thomas decided, this would be his secret to keep, at least for now. He needed time to think, to plan, to ensure this blessing wouldn't change who he was at his core. Sarah would have wanted him to be smart about this, to use it wisely and maintain the values they'd built their life around. That night, sleep eluded him. Thomas sat on his porch, watching the stars emerge above his wheat field, the same stars he'd watched as a boy, dreaming of horses running free across open pastures. Now, those dreams were within reach, but the weight of the secret pressed heavy on his chest. He knew that with great fortune came great responsibility, and he was determined to handle both with the same careful consideration he gave to tending his crops. The next morning, Thomas rose before dawn, as he had every day for the past 30 years. He did his chores, fed the chickens, and checked on his wheat. To anyone watching, it was just another day in the life of Thomas Reed, the modest farmer from Clearwater County. But inside, his mind was racing with possibilities. He drove to the bank in the neighboring town, where he'd done business since he took over the farm. Martha Wilson, the branch manager who'd known him for decades, couldn't hide her shock when he presented the winning ticket. Her hands shook as she verified the numbers, then made the necessary calls to process his claim. "Thomas," she whispered, this is life-changing." He nodded slowly, then spoke in the same measured tone he used to discuss crop yields. "Martha, I need your word that this stays between us. No one in Clearwater County needs to know just yet." Martha understood. She'd known Thomas long enough to recognize the quiet dignity in his request. Over the next few hours, they worked together to set up the necessary accounts and make arrangements for the funds to be transferred discreetly. Thomas insisted on maintaining his regular checking account, the same one he'd used for years, while the bulk of his winnings would be secured in various investments and interest-bearing accounts. As he left the bank that afternoon, Thomas felt different, yet somehow exactly the same. The weight of the secret was now balanced by the security of knowing his dream was within reach. He drove home in his old pickup, its familiar rattles and squeaks a reminder that some things didn't need to change just because circumstances had. That evening, as the sun set over his wheat field, Thomas pulled out Sarah's old Bible from the bedside table. Inside, he found the ranch advertisement he'd carefully torn from last Sunday's paper. Silver Creek Ranch, 1,000 acres of prime Montana land, with state-of-the-art stables and facilities for breeding world-class horses. The asking price had made him wince before, but now it was possible. He smoothed the wrinkled paper, studying the photographs of the magnificent property. Tomorrow, he decided, he would make the 2-hour drive to view the ranch. But he wouldn't go as a millionaire or a lottery winner. He would go as himself, Thomas Reed, the farmer who'd spent his life working the land and dreaming of horses. Let them judge him by his appearances. He'd learned long ago that true worth couldn't be measured by the clothes on one's back. As darkness fell over his small farm, Thomas sat at his kitchen table and began to plan. This blessing would be used, wisely, he determined, not just for himself, but for the good of others. Sarah would have wanted it that way. But first, he had a dream to fulfill and a lesson to teach about judging books by their covers. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Silver Creek Ranch. From a distance, the property looked like something out of a Western painting. Pristine white fences stretching across rolling hills, modern stables gleaming in the morning sun, and thoroughbred horses grazing in meticulously maintained pastures. Thomas Reed's old Ford pickup seemed out of place as it rumbled up the immaculate driveway, leaving small clouds of dust in its wake. He'd chosen to wear his usual attire, a clean but well-worn plaid shirt, his most presentable pair of work jeans, and the same boots he'd worn for the past 3 years. His father's words echoed in his mind. A man's worth isn't in his clothes, but in his character. The $50 million sitting in his bank account hadn't changed that fundamental truth. As Thomas parked his truck between two luxury SUVs, he could already feel eyes on him. Through the large windows of the main office, he noticed several well-dressed figures turning to stare, their expressions a mixture of surprise and dismissal. A young woman in an expensive equestrian outfit whispered something to her companion, both of them failing to hide their smirks. Before he could reach the office door, a tall man in a tailored suit emerged, his leather shoes crunching on the gravel with purposeful strides. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone suggesting he'd rather be doing anything else. The gold name tag on his lapel read, Alexander. "Blake, property manager." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. "I'm here about the ranch listing. Name's Thomas Reed." He extended his hand, weathered and calloused from years of honest work. Blake hesitated for a moment before offering a brief, limp handshake. "I see," he said, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "Well, Mr. Reed, Silver Creek Ranch is a rather exclusive property. The asking price is $15 million, and that's non-negotiable." He emphasized the number, clearly expecting it to end the conversation. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the sum. "I'd still like to see it, if you don't mind. Been dreaming of a horse ranch most of my life." Blake's sigh was barely concealed. "Very well, though I should warn you, this isn't your typical farm operation. Silver Creek Ranch is home to some of the finest thoroughbreds in Montana. The breeding program alone requires substantial expertise and investment." As they walked toward the stables, Thomas could hear the whispers and stifled laughter from the small group of people who had gathered to watch. One man, dressed in what appeared to be designer riding gear, nudged his companion and muttered something about tire kickers wasting everyone's time. The first stop was the main stable, a state-of-the-art facility that could house 30 horses in climate-controlled comfort. The polished concrete floors gleamed under LED lighting, and each stall was equipped with automated feeding and monitoring systems. Thomas ran his hand along the solid oak panels, appreciating the craftsmanship, while Blake rattled off specifications with increasing impatience. "These stalls cost more than most people's homes," Blake commented pointedly. "Each one is custom-built, with integrated monitoring systems that track the horse's vital signs and behavior patterns. I assume you're familiar with modern equine management software." Thomas smiled quietly. "I might surprise you," he replied, thinking of the hours he'd spent studying horse breeding and care over the years. His small library at home contained dozens of books on equine medicine and management, well worn from repeated reading. They moved on to the training arena, an indoor facility larger than Thomas's entire wheat field. The footing was perfect, a carefully engineered mixture of sand and synthetic materials that provided ideal conditions for both training and competition. Above them, a sophisticated ventilation system maintained perfect air quality, while massive windows allowed natural light to flood the space. This arena hosted the Montana Dressage Championships last year, Blake mentioned, his tone suggesting this should impress Thomas. The viewing gallery alone seats 200 people. The monthly maintenance costs for this facility are probably more than... He paused, eyeing Thomas's worn boots. "Well, let's just say it's substantial." As they walked, more ranch staff appeared, seemingly finding reasons to cross their path. Each new encounter brought fresh looks of judgment and dismissal. A group of riding instructors paused their conversation to watch them pass, their designer. Jodhpurs and polished boots, a stark contrast to Thomas's simple attire. "I think you can see," Blake continued, "that Silver Creek Ranch caters to a very specific clientele. Our buyers typically have extensive experience in the equestrian world, along with the necessary resources." He emphasized the last word, while brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his sleeve. Thomas noticed everything, every sidelong glance, every whispered comment, every subtle indication that he didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. But instead of anger, he felt a quiet determination growing inside him. Each dismissive gesture only strengthened his resolve to see this through. They reached the breeding facility, a modern marvel of veterinary science. Through large observation windows, Thomas could see the pristine laboratory where genetic testing and artificial insemination procedures were performed. The adjacent foaling stalls were equipped with round-the-clock video monitoring and emergency medical equipment. "Our breeding program has produced several championship winners," Blake explained, his tone becoming increasingly condescending. "The genetic lines we maintain here represent generations of careful selection. The stud fees alone for some of our stallions exceed 6 figures. I trust you understand the level of investment we're discussing?" Thomas nodded, still maintaining his calm demeanor. "I understand more than you might think, Mr. Blake. Sometimes the best investment a person can make is in their dreams." Blake barely contained his eye roll. "Dreams are wonderful, Mr. Reed, but this is about business. Running a facility like Silver Creek requires more than just aspirations." He gestured to a passing stable hand. "James, please bring me the financial disclosure packets from my office. Mr. Reed should at least understand what he's dreaming about." As they waited, Thomas walked to one of the paddocks, where a magnificent black stallion stood watching them. The horse's coat gleamed in the sunlight, its muscular frame a testament to careful breeding and excellent care. Thomas approached the fence slowly, and the stallion moved toward him with curious interest. "I wouldn't get too close," Blake warned. "Midnight Commander is rather particular about strangers. He's worth more than most people earn in a lifetime." But Thomas remained still, holding the stallion's gaze. After a moment, the horse stretched its neck over the fence, gently nudging Thomas's outstretched hand. The connection was immediate and natural, born from a lifetime of understanding and respecting animals. Blake watched with poorly concealed surprise as the notoriously temperamental stallion allowed Thomas to stroke its neck. For a brief moment, his carefully maintained facade of superiority cracked, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. "You seem comfortable with horses," Blake admitted reluctantly. "Been around them all my life," Thomas replied simply. "They don't care what clothes you wear or how much money you have. They just know what's in your heart." The property manager quickly recovered his professional disdain. "Yes, well, being comfortable around horses is one thing. Managing a world-class facility like Silver Creek is quite another. Perhaps we should discuss some of our more modest properties?" Thomas turned from the horse, meeting Blake's gaze directly. "No need for that. I'd like to see the rest of the main property, if you don't mind. Every acre." For the next hour, they toured the remaining facilities: the veterinary clinic, the hay storage barns, the staff quarters, and the main residence. At each stop, Blake became increasingly transparent in his attempts to discourage Thomas, emphasizing costs, complications, and the sophisticated nature of the operation. As Thomas followed Blake across the manicured grounds of Silver Creek Ranch, his mind drifted back to where his love for horses first began. It wasn't in some pristine stable or professional training facility, but in the humble surroundings of his grandfather's small farm, 40 years ago. He was just 12 when his grandfather, old Jack Reed, brought home a wild Mustang he'd found, injured on the outskirts of their property. The mare was skittish and untrusting, her dark eyes full of fear and defiance. While others suggested putting her down, old Jack saw something special in that frightened creature. "Sometimes, Thomas," he'd said, "the most valuable things in life are the ones others overlook." For 3 months, young Thomas spent every spare moment with that horse. Before school, after chores, and long into the summer evenings, he'd sit near her stall, talking softly, earning her trust one patient day at a time. He'd read every book he could find about horse behavior and healing, spending his weekends at the local library, poring over veterinary texts far beyond his years. The mare, whom they named Spirit, eventually became more than just a rescued horse. She became the catalyst for Thomas's lifelong dream. Under his grandfather's guidance, he learned not just about horses, but about the deeper truths they could teach: patience, respect, and the understanding that true bonds couldn't be bought or forced. "Mr. Reed," Blake's impatient voice cut through his memories. "Are you listening? I was explaining the property's water rights and grazing permits." Thomas nodded, his mind still partly in the past. "Yes, Mr. Blake, please continue." As they walked, Thomas remembered the day Spirit finally allowed him to touch her. It wasn't through force or fancy training techniques, but through pure patience and genuine care. That moment taught him more about working with horses than all the books he'd read combined. His dedication to horses continued through his teenage years, even as the family farm struggled through drought and economic hardship. He'd work at neighboring ranches during summers, mucking stalls and helping with basic training, absorbing everything he could about horse care and management. Every dollar he earned went into a special fund, the beginning of his ranch dream. Sarah, his late wife, had understood his passion from the moment they met. She was the veterinarian's daughter, fresh out of college and full of her own dreams about working with animals. Their courtship had blossomed over shared conversations about horse genetics and breeding programs, their modest dates often spent at local horse auctions or equestrian events. The monthly operating costs alone, Blake was saying, his voice dripping with condescension, would require substantial liquid assets, not to mention the staff payroll and insurance premiums. Thomas allowed himself a small smile, remembering how Sarah would have handled this situation. She'd always had a way of surprising people who underestimated her. When they'd first started dating, local society had dismissed her as just another pretty face with unrealistic ambitions. But she'd proven them all wrong, becoming one of the most respected large animal veterinarians in the county. Their early years together had been lean but happy. They'd saved every spare penny, planning and dreaming of the day they'd have their own ranch. Sarah would spend evenings sketching stable designs while Thomas calculated budgets and studied business plans. They'd even started a small horse rescue operation on their farm, taking in abandoned or neglected horses, rehabilitating them and finding them new homes. The tragedy of Sarah's sudden illness had put those dreams on hold. The medical bills had drained their savings, and Thomas had sold most of their rescue horses to keep up with the payments. But even in her final days, Sarah had made him promise not to give up on their shared dream. "Some dreams take longer to realize," she told him, "but that just makes them sweeter when they come true." Blake led them toward the ranch's training facilities, pointing out the Olympic-sized dressage arena and the advanced cross-country course. "Our facilities cater to serious equestrians," he emphasized. "People who understand the value of proper training and competition-level amenities." Thomas thought about the makeshift training ring he'd built on his farm, using salvaged lumber and recycled materials. It wasn't fancy, but it had served its purpose, helping dozens of rescued horses find their confidence and trust again. Sarah had always said it wasn't the facilities that made a good horse person, but the heart they brought to the work. The previous owner, Blake continued, gesturing to the estate house, invested millions in modernizing every aspect of the operation, the automation systems alone. Thomas remembered the night, just a few months after Sarah's passing, when a severe storm had damaged his barn roof. He'd stayed up all night in the pouring rain, working to protect the 3 rescue horses they still had. His neighbors had come to help without being asked, bringing tools and materials, working alongside him until dawn. That night had taught him that true wealth wasn't about money in the bank, but about the communities and connections you built. Over the years, Thomas had continued to help local youth learn about horses, offering his small farm as a place where kids could get hands-on experience. Many of them came from families who couldn't afford riding lessons or fancy equipment, but they shared his love for horses and his willingness to work hard. The breeding program, Blake was explaining, his tone becoming increasingly patronizing, requires extensive knowledge of bloodlines and genetics. Our stallions have pedigrees that go back generations. Thomas thought about old Spirit's legacy. Though she'd never had papers or pedigrees, she'd passed on something more valuable to her offspring: heart, intelligence, and a willing spirit. The local kids, who'd learned to ride on her foals, had gained confidence and responsibility that no amount of money could buy. As they approached the main office again, Thomas could see the group of well-dressed people still watching from the window, their expressions a mixture of amusement and disdain. He thought about all the times he'd been underestimated in his life, when he'd taken over the farm at 18 after his father's accident, when he'd started the rescue operation with Sarah, when he'd kept going after her death. Each challenge had taught him something valuable, adding layers to his understanding of both horses and human nature. The $50 million now in his account wouldn't change those lessons or the person they'd helped him become. If anything, they made him more determined to use this blessing in a way that would honor all those who'd helped shape his dream: his grandfather, his parents, Sarah, and every horse that had crossed his path. Blake cleared his throat, clearly ready to wrap up what he considered a waste of his morning. "Well, Mr. Reed, I believe we've seen everything. Perhaps you'd like some time to consider your options. We do have some smaller properties that might be more suitable." The sun had climbed higher in the Montana sky as Thomas and Blake made their way back to the main office of Silver Creek Ranch. The morning's tour had revealed more than just the property's impressive facilities. It had laid bare the prejudices and assumptions that Thomas had faced his entire life. Entering the opulent office space, Thomas noted how the other staff members barely concealed their ongoing amusement at his presence. A young woman in designer equestrian wear whispered something to her colleague, both stifling laughs behind manicured hands. The pristine reception area, with its leather sofas and award-filled display cases, seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Blake settled behind his massive mahogany desk, pulling out a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Reed," he began, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver a well-practiced letdown, "I believe we should discuss some practical matters." He spread several papers across the desk, each displaying impressive charts and financial projections. "As I mentioned earlier, the asking price is $15 million, Blake continued, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child. "But that's just the beginning. The annual operating costs—" He paused, glancing at Thomas's worn boots. "Well, let's just say they're substantial." Thomas listened quietly, his weathered hands resting calmly in his lap. His mind wandered to the morning 3 months ago when everything had changed. He remembered the disbelief he'd felt staring at the lottery ticket, checking and rechecking the numbers until the truth finally sank in. The process of claiming his winnings had been surprisingly straightforward. Martha Wilson at the bank had helped him handle everything with discretion, setting up secure accounts and making careful investments. "You're still the same Thomas Reed," she'd told him, "just with more resources to do good." Blake's voice cut through his thoughts. The monthly maintenance alone requires a significant cash flow. The heating and cooling systems for the indoor arena, the specialized footing maintenance, the automated feeding systems, these aren't expenses a typical farmer would be familiar with. Thomas nodded thoughtfully, remembering his conversation with his financial advisor, James Morrison, in the neighboring town. They'd spent hours discussing how to manage the windfall responsibly. $50 million is a lot of money, Morrison had said, But it's not unlimited. We need to ensure it's invested wisely. Together, they developed a comprehensive plan. A significant portion would be invested in stable, long-term securities. Another portion would be set aside for charitable causes, something Sarah would have insisted upon. And yes, a substantial amount would be allocated for the ranch purchase and operations. Furthermore, Blake continued, shuffling more papers, our insurance requirements are quite stringent. The liability coverage alone. He trailed off, clearly expecting Thomas to be overwhelmed by the mounting costs. Instead, Thomas leaned forward slightly. Mr. Blake, could you tell me more about the current breeding program? I'm particularly interested in the genetic diversity of your bloodlines. The question seemed to catch Blake off guard. He blinked, momentarily thrown by this unexpected display of knowledge. Well, yes. Our breeding program focuses on maintaining pure bloodlines from some of Europe's finest stables. Each mating is carefully planned to enhance specific traits. Thomas nodded again. And what about your success rate with problem foals? I noticed the veterinary facilities are well equipped for complicated births. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Blake's face. This wasn't going according to his script. The shabby farmer in front of him wasn't supposed to ask intelligent, technical, questions. We maintain a success rate well above industry standards, he replied, his confidence slightly shaken. The morning light streaming through the office windows caught the edge of the envelope in Thomas's pocket, the one containing proof of his lottery win. He hadn't planned on revealing his fortune just yet, but the weight of it reminded him of all the careful planning he'd done since that life-changing day. He'd spent countless hours researching modern ranch management, updating his already considerable knowledge of horse care with the latest scientific advances. Sarah's old veterinary textbooks had been supplemented with online courses and consultations with industry experts. He'd even visited several successful ranch operations under the guise of seeking work, observing their methods and management styles. Blake was now pulling out more documents, his voice taking on an edge of frustration. Mr. Reed, perhaps we should discuss the staff requirements. Silver Creek employs over 30 full-time workers, trainers, groomers, veterinary technicians, maintenance crews. The payroll expenses alone average about $150,000 monthly, Thomas finished quietly, plus benefits and insurance. The look of surprise on Blake's face was almost worth the morning's accumulated condescension. The property manager recovered quickly, though his polished veneer showed cracks. Yes, exactly. And then there's the matter of client relations. Our clientele expects a certain level of sophistication, the social aspects of running a facility like this. Thomas thought about the community he'd built over years of operating his small rescue operation. Local veterinarians who'd provide services at reduced rates, neighboring farmers who'd help with hay delivery, kids who'd volunteer their time just to be around the horses. Real relationships built on mutual respect and shared passion, not social status or bank accounts. Mr. Blake, Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime earning respect rather than demanding it, I appreciate your thorough explanation of the property's requirements. Would you mind showing me the current financial statements, including the operating costs and revenue projections for the past 3 years? The request, delivered so professionally, seemed to further unbalance Blake. He opened and closed his mouth several times before responding. Those documents are typically only shared with serious buyers who have provided proof of financial qualification. Thomas smiled slightly. Of course, I understand completely. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the envelope that contained not just the lottery verification, but detailed financial statements prepared by his advisors. But he kept it where it was, not yet ready to reveal his hand. Instead, he stood up slowly, every movement carrying the deliberate grace of someone comfortable in their own skin. I'd like to walk the property one more time, if you don't mind. Alone this time. I find it helps to get a feel for a place without distractions. Blake's relief at what he assumed was Thomas's imminent departure was palpable. Certainly, Mr. Reed, though I should mention we have another showing scheduled this afternoon, a very qualified buyer from California. The implication was clear. Don't waste any more of our time. As Thomas stepped out of the office into the Montana sunshine, the whispers and snickers from inside followed him like persistent shadows. He could hear Blake's voice through the partially open window, already on the phone with someone, barely containing his amusement as he described the farmer who thought he could buy Silver Creek. Making his way toward the main stable complex, Thomas noticed how the ranch staff's behavior had shifted. Where earlier they had at least maintained a veneer of professional courtesy in Blake's presence, now they felt free to display their prejudices openly. A group of stable hands stopped their work to watch him pass, exchanging knowing looks and barely concealed smirks. "Hey, old-timer," one called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "The farmer's market is in town, not here." The comment drew laughter from his companions, the sound echoing off the stable walls. Thomas kept walking, his boots crunching steadily on the gravel path. He'd faced this kind of judgment before, when he'd first started his rescue operation, when he'd tried to secure loans for farm equipment, when he'd attended high-end horse auctions in his work clothes. Each instance had taught him that dignity wasn't in how others treated you, but in how you carried yourself. A well-dressed woman leading an expensive show horse gave him a wide berth, as if his mere presence might somehow contaminate her pristine riding outfit. She whispered something to her companion, both of them glancing back at him with unveiled disdain. "Can you believe Blake actually showed him around?" he overheard one saying. "As if someone like that could ever belong here." The stable manager, a man named Richard Thompson, according to his embroidered shirt, emerged from one of the climate-controlled stalls. His expression hardened when he saw Thomas. "Sir!" he called out, his tone more commanding than courteous. "These are private facilities, unless you're accompanied by Mr. Blake." "Mr. Blake gave me permission to walk the grounds," Thomas replied calmly, meeting the manager's suspicious gaze. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "Well, we have valuable horses here. Very valuable. I'll need to accompany you." The implication was clear. He didn't trust Thomas alone near the animals. As they walked, Thompson made sure to emphasize the sophistication and expense of every feature they passed. "These automatic waterers cost more than most cars," he commented, watching Thomas from the corner of his eye. "The temperature-controlled flooring system alone was imported from Germany. I assume you're familiar with advanced equine comfort systems." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion erupted from one of the nearby paddocks. A young stallion, clearly agitated, was charging the fence, causing several staff members to back away in alarm. The horse's eyes were wide with fear, its movements increasingly erratic. "Someone get Dr. Harrison!" Thompson shouted, referring to the ranch's veterinarian. "And keep that man away from the fence," he added, gesturing dismissively at Thomas. But Thomas had already noticed what was causing the horse's distress. A piece of plastic sheeting from some recent construction had blown into the paddock, wrapping around the horse's back leg. The more the animal moved, the more entangled it became. "He needs help now," Thomas said quietly, already moving toward the gate. Thompson stepped in front of him. "Sir, this is a $100,000 horse. We can't have some random farmer." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "That $100,000 horse is about to hurt himself if someone doesn't help him right now. I've been handling horses since before you were born, Mr. Thompson. Now you can either help me or stand there and watch that animal injure himself." Something in Thomas's voice, the quiet authority, the absolute certainty, made Thompson hesitate. In that moment of indecision, Thomas was already moving past him, entering the paddock with slow, deliberate movements. The gathered crowd watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as Thomas approached the panicked horse. His voice, when he spoke to the animal, was low and soothing, carrying the kind of confidence that comes from decades of experience. "Easy now, friend," he murmured, maintaining eye contact with the frightened stallion. "Let's get that thing off your leg." His movements were sure and careful, each step calculated to appear non-threatening. The horse's ears flicked toward Thomas's voice, its movements becoming less frantic. Years of working with rescued horses had taught Thomas the patience needed. In such situations, he continued talking softly, gradually closing the distance between them. "Sir, please," Thompson called from outside the fence, his voice tight with anxiety. "Dr. Harrison will be here any minute." But Thomas was focused entirely on the horse now. He'd reached the animal's side, still speaking in that calm, reassuring tone. With practiced efficiency, he began working the plastic free from the horse's leg, his weathered hands moving with surprising gentleness. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Blake himself had emerged from the office, his face darkening when he saw Thomas in the paddock with one of their most valuable horses. But before he could intervene, something remarkable happened. The horse, moments ago in a blind panic, began to calm under Thomas's touch. His experienced hands moved surely but gently, freeing the last of the plastic while continuing to speak soothingly to the animal. Within minutes, the crisis was over. "There you go," Thomas said softly, running a hand along the horse's neck. "No harm done." He checked the leg quickly but thoroughly, his fingers finding no signs of injury. The gathered crowd stood in stunned silence. The horse, now completely calm, nudged Thomas's shoulder almost affectionately. Years of experience had taught him that horses could sense authenticity. They didn't care about designer clothes or bank accounts, only the true nature of the person handling them. Blake was the first to break the silence, his voice sharp with barely contained anger. "Mr. Reed, while we appreciate your intervention, I must insist that you leave the handling of our horses to our professional staff." The atmosphere at Silver Creek Ranch had shifted palpably after Thomas's handling of the panicked horse. Where before there had been open mockery, now there was an undercurrent of confused uncertainty. The stable hands whispered among themselves, their earlier derision mixed with reluctant respect for what they'd just witnessed. Blake, however, seemed more determined than ever to reassert control over the situation. He strode across the yard, his expensive shoes kicking up small clouds of dust, his face set in a mask of professional displeasure. "Mr. Reed," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of authority, "I believe we should conclude our tour. As I mentioned, we have other potential buyers arriving shortly." Thomas stood his ground, still gently patting the now calm stallion. "Of course, Mr. Blake. Though I'd like to see those financial statements we discussed earlier. Seems only right, considering I'm interested in making an offer." A ripple of poorly concealed laughter ran through the gathered crowd. Blake's smile was thin and patronizing. "Mr. Reed, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, Silver Creek Ranch requires a certain level of financial capability that frankly appears to be beyond your means." "Is that so?" Thomas replied quietly, his calm demeanor unchanged. "And you've determined this how, exactly?" "How?" Blake gestured vaguely at Thomas's worn clothing and weathered appearance. "Let's be realistic here. This is a $15 million property with substantial operating costs. The monthly maintenance alone would exceed what most small farmers earn in a year. I've been very patient, but I think it's time we stopped pretending." "Pretending what, Mr. Blake?" Thomas's voice remained steady, but there was a new edge to it. "That someone who doesn't match your image of wealth couldn't possibly belong here? That the worth of a person can be measured by the clothes they wear?" The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the mounting tension. Among them was Dr. Sarah Harrison, the ranch veterinarian, who had arrived too late for the earlier incident. She watched the exchange with professional interest, her expression thoughtful. Blake's composure slipped slightly. "Mr. Reed, this isn't about prejudice. It's simple economics. Running a facility like Silver Creek requires substantial resources, extensive experience, and a certain level of sophistication. We have a reputation to maintain." "And you think that reputation comes from fancy clothes and expensive cars?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom. "Not from how you treat the animals or the quality of care you provide?" "Our records speak for themselves." Blake snapped, his patience wearing thin. "We've produced champion horses, hosted international events. This isn't some backyard operation where you can learn as you go. Our clients expect excellence." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes, I noticed your client focused during the tour. Tell me, Mr. Blake, when was the last time you actually worked with the horses yourself? Not managing them, not showing them off to clients, but really worked with them." The question seemed to catch Blake off guard. He straightened his already perfect tie, a nervous gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "That's hardly relevant. My role is to manage this facility and ensure it maintains its prestigious position in the industry." "I see," Thomas replied. "And that prestigious position, does it include having your stable hands use incorrect leg wraps on your most expensive stallion?" He gestured toward a nearby stall where, indeed, the wraps had been applied incorrectly, something only an experienced horseman would notice. Dr. Harrison stepped forward then, her professional interest piqued. She moved to check the wraps, confirming Thomas's observation. "He's right," she announced, causing several stable hands to shift uncomfortably. Blake's face reddened. A minor oversight that would have been caught during routine checks. "This doesn't change the fact that you're clearly not qualified to—" "Not qualified?" Thomas's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the surface now. "I've spent 40 years working with horses, Mr. Blake. I've helped birth foals in thunderstorms, rehabilitated abused animals everyone else had given up on, and taught countless young people the value of patience and respect. But you're right about one thing. I don't match your image of what a ranch owner should look like." The gathered crowd had grown silent, watching the exchange with increasing intensity. Even those who had laughed at Thomas earlier were now listening intently, something in his words resonating with their own experiences. Blake attempted to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Reed, your experience with basic horse care is admirable, but Silver Creek is in a different league entirely. Our clients—" "Your clients," Thomas interrupted gently, "care about results, don't they? About having their horses well cared for, about seeing them thrive and succeed? Or do they only care about the superficial things, the marble floors in the viewing gallery, the imported furniture in the office?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Some of the stable hands exchanged knowing looks. They'd seen their share of wealthy clients who cared more about appearances than the actual welfare of their horses. Dr. Harrison spoke up again. "Mr. Blake, I have to say, Mr. Reed's assessment of our operations has been surprisingly accurate. His handling of that stallion earlier showed considerable expertise." Blake shot her a warning look. "Dr. Harrison, please, we're not running a charity here. The financial requirements alone—" "Yes, let's talk about those financial requirements," Thomas said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. "You mentioned wanting to see proof of capability. Should we discuss that now, or would you prefer to continue judging me based on my appearance?" The property manager's face flickered with uncertainty for the first time. Something in Thomas's tone, in the quiet confidence with which he spoke, suggested there was more to this simple farmer than met the eye. The tension in the air at Silver Creek Ranch had reached a crescendo. The gathered crowd, stable hands, trainers, and administrative staff, stood in a loose circle around Thomas and Blake, watching the confrontation unfold like spectators at a high-stakes poker game. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculate courtyard, highlighting the stark contrast between Blake's polished appearance and Thomas's weathered dignity. Blake had spent the entire morning trying to discourage this supposedly presumptuous farmer, and his frustration was finally boiling over. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice sharp with barely contained irritation, "I've been more than patient. I've shown you the property, explained our operations, and tolerated your interventions. But this charade has gone on long enough." Thomas stood quietly, one hand still resting on the nose of the stallion he'd calmed earlier. The horse's gentle breathing provided a steady counterpoint to the mounting tension. "Charade, Mr. Blake? Is that what you call it when someone doesn't fit your preconceptions?" "What I call it," Blake snapped, his professional veneer cracking, "is a waste of valuable time. Do you have any idea how many serious buyers we have interested in this property? People with actual means to purchase and maintain a facility of this caliber?" Dr. Harrison, still standing nearby, watched the exchange with growing concern. She'd seen something in Thomas's handling of the horse earlier, a natural ability that couldn't be bought or taught. "Mr. Blake, perhaps we should—" "No, Sarah." Blake cut her off, using her first name in a clear breach of professional protocol. "This needs to be said." He turned back to Thomas, years of hidden disdain finally finding voice. "Let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Reed. Silver Creek Ranch is not some hobby farm where you can live out your cowboy fantasies. This is a world-class facility that requires millions in liquid capital just to maintain basic operations." The property manager began pacing, his expensive shoes clicking against the cobblestones. "Our clients are industry leaders, professional competitors, people who understand the value of excellence. They expect to see a certain level of sophistication when they visit. Not—" he gestured dismissively at Thomas's worn clothing, "this." Thomas absorbed the insults with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all morning, but something had changed in his eyes. The patient understanding was replaced by a steely resolve. "And what exactly is this, Mr. Blake? A man who's spent his life working. Honestly, someone who knows horses well enough to spot your staff's mistakes, or just someone who doesn't match your idea of what wealth should look like?" Blake laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed off the stable walls. "Wealth? Mr. Reed, let's stop pretending. I've seen your type before, dreamers who think they can walk into a place like this and somehow make it work through— what did you call it? Hard work and honest living?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Many of the stable hands and trainers had come from humble beginnings themselves, working their way up through the industry. Blake's words struck a nerve. "You know nothing about running a business of this scale," Blake continued, warming to his theme. "The insurance premiums alone would bankrupt your little farm in a month. The property taxes would take everything you've saved in a year. The payroll for our staff—" He shook his head in exaggerated disbelief. "No, Mr. Reed. It's time for you to go back to your wheat field and leave this world to those who understand it." Thomas's response was quiet but clear. "And who exactly would that be, Mr. Blake? People like yourself, who judge worth by appearance, who mistake arrogance for competence." Blake's face reddened. "How dare you? I've managed this facility for 5 years. I've hosted international events, negotiated million-dollar breeding contracts. What have you done? Rescued a few broken-down horses? Taught some local kids to ride?" "Yes," Thomas replied simply. "That's exactly what I've done. I've helped animals that people like you had written off. I've taught young people that their worth isn't measured by their bank accounts or their clothing brands. And I've learned more about horses from those experiences than you'll ever learn in your air-conditioned office." The property manager's composure finally shattered completely. "Security!" he barked, gesturing to the uniformed guards stationed near the main gate. "Please escort Mr. Reed off the property and make sure he understands that he's not welcome to return." The guards hesitated, looking uncertainly between Blake and Thomas. There was something about the older man's calm demeanor that made them reluctant to act. "Is this really necessary?" Dr. Harrison interjected. "Mr. Reed has shown considerable knowledge and expertise. Perhaps we should—" "What I should do," Blake interrupted, "is have him arrested for trespassing, coming here wasting our time, pretending to be a serious buyer." He turned back to Thomas, his voice thick with disdain. "Did you think we wouldn't see through it? That we'd actually believe someone like you could afford a place like this?" Thomas watched the guards approaching, their movements slow and uncertain. The stallion behind him nickered softly, as if sensing the tension in the air. The crowd had grown larger still, word of the confrontation drawing people from every corner of the ranch. "Someone like me," Thomas repeated softly. "You keep saying that, Mr. Blake. I wonder, what exactly do you think you know about someone like me?" The afternoon sun hung low over Silver Creek Ranch, casting long shadows across the immaculate grounds. The gathered crowd stood in tense silence, watching, as the security guards approached Thomas with visible reluctance. Even they seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Blake stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Mr. Reed, you've provided us with quite enough entertainment for one day. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before trying to play in a league that's clearly beyond your means." Thomas looked around slowly, taking in the scene. The stable hands who had mocked him earlier now seemed uncomfortable, their earlier derision replaced by uncertainty. Dr. Harrison watched with professional interest, her analytical mind clearly processing everything she'd observed. And there was Blake, so secure in his judgment, so certain of his superiority. "You know, Mr. Blake," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "my late wife Sarah used to say that money doesn't change who you are. It just makes you more of who you already were." He reached into his jacket pocket, removing the envelope he'd carried all morning. She was right about that, as she was about most things. Blake's eyes narrowed at the envelope. "What's this supposed to be? Some kind of proof that you can actually afford this place?" His laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Please, Mr. Reed, don't embarrass yourself further." Thomas smiled slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something others didn't. "Actually, Mr. Blake, that's exactly what it is." He turned to Dr. Harrison. "Doctor, would you mind taking a look at these documents? As a professional, I'd value your opinion." Dr. Harrison stepped forward, accepting the envelope with curiosity. As she opened it and began reading, her eyes widened noticeably. She looked up at Thomas, then back at the papers, then at Thomas again. These are—" "Yes," Thomas nodded. "They are." Blake's smirk wavered slightly. "What is it? What are you playing at?" Dr. Harrison cleared her throat professionally. "These are banking documents and financial statements showing Mr. Reed to be the recent winner of the Montana State Lottery. The amount," she paused, looking at Blake significantly, "is $50 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses in their stalls seemed to sense the dramatic shift in the atmosphere. Blake's face went through a remarkable series of transformations, from skepticism to disbelief, from disbelief to shock, and finally to dawning horror. That's impossible," he stammered, reaching for the documents with trembling hands. "You're the lottery winner? The one they haven't identified yet? But you're just a farmer?" Thomas finished for him. "Someone who doesn't match your image of what wealth should look like?" "Yes, Mr. Blake, that's exactly who I am." The crowd erupted in murmurs. The stable hands who had laughed at Thomas earlier now looked mortified. The trainers who had dismissed him were suddenly finding the ground very interesting. And Blake looked like a man watching his world crumble around him. But you didn't say anything, he managed finally. All morning while you were what, Mr. Blake? Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. While you were judging me by my clothes, making assumptions about my worth based on appearances, teaching everyone here that the only thing that matters is how much money someone appears to have. Dr. Harrison stepped forward again. Mr. Reed, if I may ask, why did you let this go on all morning? Why not simply show these documents right away? Thomas turned to her, appreciation in his eyes for her professional demeanor throughout the day. Because, Doctor, I needed to see the true character of this place, not just its facilities or its operations, but its heart. A ranch isn't just buildings and bloodlines, it's people, and how those people treat others, especially those they think can't benefit them, says everything about how they'll treat the animals in their care. Blake had recovered enough to attempt damage control. Mr. Reed, I must apologize for any misunderstanding. Had you known I was wealthy, you would have treated me differently, Thomas finished. And that, Mr. Blake, is precisely the problem. The price of this ranch isn't just $15 million. It's the responsibility to maintain something special, something that should be about more than just status and appearance. He turned to address the gathered crowd. I've spent my life working with horses because they judge you by who you are, not what you wear or what's in your bank account. They know if you're genuine, if you care, if you're willing to put in the work. No amount of money can buy that kind of understanding. The stable hands nodded unconsciously. They knew this truth, even if they'd forgotten it somewhere along the way. Dr. Harrison was smiling now, a look of professional approval on her face. So yes, Mr. Blake, Thomas continued, I can afford this ranch. I can afford the insurance premiums, the staff salaries, the maintenance costs, and everything else you've spent the morning throwing in my face. But more importantly, I understand what this place could be. Not just a showcase for wealth, but a true center of horsemanship, where both animals and people are valued for their genuine worth. The revelation of Thomas's fortune had transformed the atmosphere at Silver Creek Ranch. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, casting a warm glow over the gathered crowd that seemed to mirror the shift in their perspectives. Blake stood rooted to the spot, his earlier arrogance replaced by a painful awareness of his catastrophic misjudgment. Mr. Reed, he began again, his voice now almost pleading, perhaps we could start over. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that... Thomas held up a weathered hand, silencing him mid-sentence. No, Mr. Blake, I don't think we'll be starting over. In fact, I believe we're finished here. He turned to Dr. Harrison, who still held the financial documents. Doctor, would you mind accompanying me to the office? I'd like to make an offer on the property. Blake's face paled further. But I'm the property manager. All offers need to go through me. Not any more, came a new voice. Everyone turned to see an elegantly dressed woman striding across the courtyard. It was Margaret Sterling, the ranch's owner, who had apparently been watching the entire scene unfold from her office window. Mr. Blake, consider this your notice. Your services will no longer be required at Silver Creek. The property manager sputtered in disbelief. Mrs. Sterling, you can't be serious. I've managed this facility for 5 years. Our profits have never been higher. Yes, Margaret replied coldly. And in that time, we've also lost some of our most experienced staff, alienated local breeders, and forgotten what this ranch was supposed to be about. She turned to Thomas with a respectful nod. Mr. Reed, I apologize for how you've been treated today. Would you join me in my office? I believe we have much to discuss. As Thomas followed Margaret toward the main building, The crowd began to disperse, but not before many of the stable hands and trainers approached him to offer their own apologies. The young man who had made the farmer's market joke earlier looked especially shamefaced. "Sir," he said, his eyes downcast, "what I said earlier, I was wrong. I'm sorry." Thomas paused, studying the young man's face. "What's your name, son?" "Michael, sir, Michael Torres. I've worked here for 2 years, but I started out just like you, on my family's small farm." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And somewhere along the way, you forgot what that felt like, didn't you? Forgot what it was like to be judged by appearances rather than ability." Michael nodded, embarrassed. "Yes, sir. I guess I wanted to feel like I belonged here, in this a fancy place, started acting like I thought rich people should act." "Well, Michael," Thomas said with a gentle smile, "if I end up buying this ranch, I hope you'll stay on. Sometimes the best lessons in life come from remembering where we started." In Margaret Sterling's office, the atmosphere was markedly different from Blake's earlier posturing. The ranch's owner listened intently as Thomas outlined his vision for Silver Creek, not just as a prestigious breeding facility, but as a place that would combine world-class horsemanship with the values he'd learned over a lifetime of working with horses. "We could maintain the breeding program," he explained, "but also add a rescue and rehabilitation center. Use our resources to help horses that others have given up on. Create apprenticeship programs for young people who have the passion but not the means to enter the industry." Margaret's eyes lit up with recognition. "That's what this place was meant to be," she said softly. "My father started Silver Creek with similar ideals, but somewhere along the way, under managers like Blake, it became more about status than substance." The negotiations proceeded smoothly. Thomas's offer was fair, and his plans for the ranch aligned with Margaret's own hopes for her family's legacy. By the time they emerged from the office, the sun had set completely, and the stars were beginning to appear over the Montana sky. Word of the day's events had spread quickly through the local equestrian community. As Thomas walked back to his truck, several of the ranch's regular clients had arrived, curious about the changes to come. Among them was a well-known trainer who had worked with Olympic teams. "Mr. Reed," the trainer said, extending his hand, "I hear you're going to be the new owner of Silver Creek. I have to say, after what I witnessed today, I'm looking forward to working with someone who understands what really matters in this business." Thomas accepted the handshake with characteristic humility. "What matters," he replied, "is remembering that every person and every horse deserves to be judged on their true worth, not their appearance or their price tag." As he prepared to leave, Dr. Harrison approached him one final time. "Mr. Reed, will you be making any changes to the veterinary program?" Thomas smiled. "Only additions, Doctor. I've seen your work today. Your concern for the horses, your professional integrity. I hope you'll stay on and help us build something special here." The night had fully settled over Silver Creek Ranch as Thomas finally climbed into his old pickup truck. The same truck that had drawn sneers earlier now sat proudly in front of what would soon be his dream realized. But he wasn't thinking about the money or the prestige. His mind was on the horses in the stable, the young workers like Michael who needed guidance, and the opportunity to create something that would honor Sarah's memory. As he drove down the long driveway, past the gleaming facilities and manicured paddocks, Thomas reflected on the day's events. His $50 million hadn't changed who he was. It had simply given him the means to show others what he had known all along. That true worth comes from character, not wealth, from actions, not appearances, and from the way you treat others, especially when you think they have nothing to offer you. The stars twinkled overhead as he turned onto the main road, heading back to his small farm one last time. Tomorrow would bring paperwork and plans, lawyers and accountants, but tonight Thomas Reed was simply grateful. grateful for the chance to prove that sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, even if they happen to be wearing muddy boots and driving an old pickup truck.